Welcome, everyone, from Westside and anyone else joining us for our study of church history in the early centuries. We're looking at the Roman official persecution of the Christians that was sporadic in the first and second centuries, but by the third century, and especially into the very early part of the fourth century, it became a matter of trying to wipe out Christianity from existence. And so that's the part of the lesson that we'll get into today. Again, we appreciate you joining us for our study and look forward to what we can do together in this study. A couple of passages, both out of Revelation chapter 2. Again, the seven churches of Asia that would later become the focal point of so much of the persecution because of the where the emperor worship was situated. And if Revelation is written at the 90 something AD time period, then it definitely under Domitian was the beginning of that being very much a push with the Roman emperors that would follow Domitian. And again, mostly that would occur sporadically in the second century, but by the third would be more systemic. A couple of the things that he says, and I think that we need to be mindful of this as Christians. To the church at Smyrna, he said, to the angel of the church at Smyrna, chapter 2, verse 8. At verse 10, he said, "Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life." Now, just as this picture shows a famous painting in 1883 in our modern time period of the last prayer of the Christians, and while this would not have been a scene that would have occurred often, it would occur more often in the centuries that we're coming to in our study. And again, it did happen. Sometimes you'll see people try to say it never happened, but that's just not so. There's evidence, there's too much written about it to indicate that it did. The other church is, of course, the church at Pergamos, and this was one of the seats of one of the prime seats of the worship of the emperor. A great temple was built there to the divine nature of the emperor. And he says to them at verse 13, "I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr." So obviously, Antipas had lost his life as being a faithful martyr, "who was killed among you where Satan dwells." And the reason that I read these passages and others is that to remind us that we have lived in very strange times, to live in a country that for the most part, because of the religious freedoms that are just enshrined in our Bill of Rights and into the very fabric of our nation's history, it just seems impossible that God's people would be so persecuted in the United States of America. But I would remind you that things are changing very rapidly. When you consider the promotion of homosexuality, of marriage by homosexuals to homosexuals, of the change of sex operations and those kinds of things, the fact that you see a bent going in a direction, as our brother Ross talked to us Sunday, using the illustration that all of us have seen happen of the Portland rioters just recently burning Bibles. I mean, the hatred for what God says against sin, against certain kinds of sin, again, is arousing that same kind of animosity that was aroused by the pagans when they realized Christians were going to be very different in their lifestyles, and they did not appreciate it, nor like it, nor love the Christians because of it. And again, if the state becomes involved in that, if they feel threatened by what Christians are standing for, and that may take a great deal of time in our country, but it may not. When you see corporations that on their front pages of their websites put the LGBTQ movement forefront in what they say, instead of being concerned about the manufacture of goods and services, they're more concerned about the political rightness or correctness of that movement. And when that comes in conflict with what God says, the Christian's going to have to stand firm. And what we're going to find out is that the Christians in this time period were faced with life and death, and many of them did not go to death, and therefore lapsed in their Christianity. And it'll be a good study today about what we also must think about in the future and what could happen with any of us. All right, so we begin in the 3rd century with a man by the name of Trajanus or Trajan. You can see that that name was actually taken by him, given to him by the Senate when he had scored a great victory. These emperors that we are considering now are not Italian. All of those that were considered, when we think of Nero and that dynasty and all of that in the beginning of the 1st century, were all Italians. But by now that has passed. In fact, all people of the Roman Empire, I believe the year was 214, were made Roman citizens. So while that was a very, very specific and blessed thing that Paul, for instance, would use on a number of occasions to protect himself against being subjugated to very bad treatment, terrible treatment, that is, be flogged and all of that, that he could just cite he's a Roman citizen and they would withdraw from him. And so now everyone in the Roman Empire, aliens alike, are made Roman citizens. And because of that, I think sometimes we have to think in the background of the Romans, what was going on. They were facing the attack across all of their northern border, the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Goth, Goth that we think of today has nothing to do with that, but they were a tribe of the Germanic peoples that were pressing the Romans hard. And these Roman emperors, the one we're looking at today, come from the Danube area. Again, they themselves are not Italians, but they are fierce warriors. And Trajanus Decius, or we know him as Decius, was a very victorious Roman general in pushing back the Goths. And because of all of the terrible things that were going on at this time in the empire, there would be 30 different men who would claim the Roman throne to be emperor in this century. So you imagine the number of civil wars that were fought at the same time and trying to push back the foreign foes that were invading and destroying as far down, sometimes in Asia Minor, as Ephesus, were destroying down into Thessalonica in Greece. I mean, it was a terrible time. Economically, it was a terrible time. And so Decius, because of that, believed that back of the Roman state were the Roman gods, and therefore that needed to be shored up. And he was an avid promoter of traditional Roman values and its gods. So on the 3rd of January in 250, he offered the annual sacrifice of the Roman gods in Rome, and he issued an edict that all Roman citizens, and of course that's everyone by this time in the Roman Empire, were to do that. Shelley says in his book, under Decius, Caesar worship was made universal and compulsory for every race and nation within the empire, with the single exception of the Jews. Every Roman citizen had to come to the temple of Caesar and had to burn a pinch of incense and say, Caesar is Lord. And he pushes it because, again, understanding the background, he believed that the Roman gods are not worshipped. If they're not served, then that's part of the problem, part of why they're suffering so in the Roman Empire at that time. And therefore Christianity is looked at as being diametrically opposed, that they would be drawing citizens away from loyalty to Rome. And that is one thing Rome would not tolerate. And so Davidson says in his book, every person throughout the empire had to obtain a special certificate or libellus, proving that the statutory sacrifice, you only had to do it once a year, had been performed in the presence of designated officials. In fact, they set up these designated sacrificial officials throughout the empire. Archaeologists have uncovered a number of these documents from the sands of Egypt. There's a picture of one to the left there on your screen that, again, due to the dry climate, the very dry climate, arid climate in Egypt, these papyri, and that's paper that was on the papyrus plant, have survived. And here is an example of just one of them called a libellus. And you had to have that in your possession. You had to be able to show it to the Roman officials that they came and wanted to know had you offered the annual sacrifice. To go on with the quote, and it is clear from the wording of them that they were deliberately designed to identify those who would not obey Decius' mandate. So it was no way out. and you had to have this certificate. Isn't it interesting that the Latin word libellus is, of course, where we get our word, English word libel. And if you slander someone, that means you do it verbally. But libel, to quote the American Heritage Dictionary, is any written, printed, or pictorial statement that damages a person by defaming his character or exposing him to ridicule. So it is interesting that while a libellus was meant to be that affirms you with the Romans, because Christianity came to dominate the West, libel became the idea of something that had been done negatively towards somebody. And so the libellus was looked at by Christianity as being, you have sold Christ out, and therefore it took on a very negative connotation. To the Romans, a very positive connotation. And from that, we get our word libel, that means you write anything of defamation about someone else's character. Now, the Christians' response was almost wholesale acquiescence to the emperor's demand. In fact, we're going to find out that bishops sold out, many people sold out and did not offer the sacrifices. The Bishop of Smyrna, we read a minute ago about Smyrna and the 7 churches of Asia. His name was Euctemon, led his congregation in person to the temple of Caesar to perform the sacrifice. So not only does he perform the sacrifice, he leads all of his brethren to do so. In fact, there was a fellow presbyter there. Remember that the bishop became dominant over all of them, but the others were called presbyters. They all should have been equal. Presbyter means elder. They all should have been, but we've looked at that already in a previous lesson. But there was one presbyter among them named Pionius, and he would not offer the sacrifice. In fact, the town's rulers tried to get him to do so, and there was others along with him, I think 3 or 4 others. And he would refuse. In fact, they had to drag him in. He didn't even want to come. He was trying to keep himself from even being brought to the place where the sacrifice was held. But at the same time, Euctemon is offering a sacrifice to get him out of it. Pionius is not, and will suffer death before when the proconsul comes. He will condemn him to death, and along with the others, they will die, be burned alive. And yet, at the very time he's doing that, Euctemon, his bishop, and the bishop of Smyrna, was offering his own lamb to prove his own truth to the Caesar, to Decius. He brought his own lamb, not provided by the state, to sacrifice to the gods. So you see that there was a large majority of believers at that time, including a great many of the leaders, that took the easy way out. The bishops of Carthage, Cyprian, we'll come back to him later, and Alexandria, Dionysius, fled into exile to escape torture or execution, sometimes leaving the flock that they were supposed to have been the overseers of at great danger. Many Christians, we know from the stories that are told, bribed officials to give them that labelli, the plural, these sheets, that the picture of it to the left. But a considerable number, Michael Grant says in his book, The Roman Emperors, a considerable number of Christian men and women refused to obey and were put to death. Now, we're going to come later to when these lapsed people, these ones that had denied the faith, tried to come back, and it's going to present a great problem. All right, Michael Grant goes on to say, Decius singled out the church directors, he means by that the bishops, the presbyters, for removal with more determination than any of his predecessors after executing Pope Fabianus. Now, again, at this early stage, that title was not recognized universally. Do not yet think that the Roman bishop was recognized as a pope of the Roman Catholic Church, but it's fast approaching that. And so even at this time, sometimes you will see him referred to, the Bishop of Rome, as pope. But he's really the bishop, along with the bishops of Carthage, Alexandria, and Antioch, and so forth. He is said to have remarked, Decius said, I would far rather receive news of a rival to the throne as emperor than of another bishop in Rome. That's how much he hated Christianity, realized what a problem it was. It seemed to him that the Christian leaders tempted his other subjects away from paying reverence to the pagan religion, which was the backbone of the state and of its welfare. And given they were going through great trials at this time, horrible things were happening in the empire, and so that's why he was so fervent in his persecution of the Christians. Following him was a man, in fact they were close compatriots, Decius and Valerian. There's a couple of years difference between them, and I didn't cover those emperors, but one of those emperors also persecutes the Christians. But Valerian becomes more the problem. In the summer of 257, Valerian initiated a new wave of persecutions. His edicts were specifically aimed at the church and its leaders. Christians not only had to acknowledge the Roman gods, but were also forbidden to assemble to worship. Now, Decius had not done those kinds of things. You could not assemble as a congregation or visit the Christian cemeteries. Valerian ordered the arrest and punishment of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Prominent lay people were to have their property confiscated and lose their status. Aristocratic women were to be exiled. Civil servants who professed Christianity were to be reduced to slavery. And so Valerian, we know, executed the Bishop of Rome, Sixtus, in 258, and the Bishop of Carthage, Cyprian, was executed in that same year. Again, he became hard against the Christians. Now, for the most part, the remainder of the century was relatively calm for the Christians in political terms. The oppressions of Decius and Valerian did not succeed in crushing the churches. I find it interesting. There were two terrible, terrible things happen in Roman history. The first is Decius becomes the first Roman emperor to be killed by foreigners in a battle. He was killed in the battle with the Goths, away from Rome, far away by the Danube River, but he was the first Roman emperor for that to happen to. And Valerian was captured in the east. They were being punished by the Persians, and so he went to meet that leader in battle and to try to talk first in the course of fighting, and nothing had been decided. Then they tried to negotiate. And when Valerian came to negotiate with the leader of Persia, he was captured, was taken back captive. So you imagine capturing, for instance, the President of the United States and hauling him back to Iran today, and Persia never released him. They never, out of by concessions or by military maneuvers, nobody was able to help Valerian escape, and he died in captivity in Persia. But isn't that fascinating? The two men that were the most serious persecutors of the church suffered the most humiliating thing to happen to Rome in all of its history, to have their emperor captured by a foreign foe, to have the first emperor in history be killed by foreigners. All right, so we skip for the next 40, 50 years. There's relative peace, and we come to a man that you might know his name as trying to instigate probably the most hard persecution to try to exterminate Christianity from all of the Roman Empire. His name was Diocletian. Again, Diocletian comes from that same Danubian area. In 303, now he had served then almost to the end of his time, he suddenly ordered the most vicious of all persecutions of the Christians for 18 years. Diocletian, although himself a convinced and practicing pagan, paid no attention to the growing Christian power. His court was full of Christian officials, and his wife Prisca and his daughter Valeria were considered Christians. Impressive church buildings appeared in the principal cities of the empire, the largest in his capital of Nicomedia. So it's fascinating that it took him that long, given the history of what Valerian and Decius had done just a half century before that. In fact, here is where Nicomedia is. What you're going to find in the Roman Empire at this time is that they realized that in fact, Rome was just an impractical place to try to rule the vastness of their empire from. So they had divided it into what basically eventually would become the East and the Western empires. And Constantinople, or what we know today as Istanbul in Turkey, would become the seat of Constantine's empire in the East, and the Roman one in the West, of course, would stay at Rome. But you could move in the empire better if you were in this Turkey area, what we know today as Turkey. You see the seven churches of Asia there in the black with their listing where their cities were. I've put in red for you where Nicomedia is. Again, Constantinople would be a different place than that. But at this time, this was Diocletian's capital, and where he ruled the eastern part of the empire. Here are some of the things that he ordered to be done. He ordered the army purged of all Christians. In fact, if they confessed that they were Christians, many of them were put to death. I read of one incident where a man was to be promoted to be a centurion, and a rival informed on him that he was a Christian, and he would not deny the faith and was put to death. Church buildings were ordered to be destroyed, burned to the ground. Sunday worship was prohibited. The scriptures, if they could be confiscated, were, you can imagine how expensive scriptures were in that day, being hand copied before the printing press, long before the printing press happened. They were burned. The bishops were arrested, imprisoned, tortured. Many were put to death. The power of the imperial throne, as Shelley says, was turned loose to wipe out the Christian community in blood. The new Augustus in the East, what we're going to find out, is going to even be more vindictive than Diocletian. In 305, Diocletian had long been planning this. He's not assassinated like so many of them, but he abdicates. He steps down. He had set up, he was considered Augustus, taking the name of the very first emperor in the East, and he forced Maximian, his fellow Augustus, in the West, so that there were those two Augusti, the plural, and then they had two Caesars. They called them Caesars below them. And also the hope was, too, that there would be a peaceful advancement. And there was some of that, but still often there was just murder and mayhem, and who then you'd have to go attack. And that happens again and again. Like I said to you, there were 30 claimants to the throne in the AD 200 to 300 AD. So Diocletian long had been planning this, and he forced Maximin to do the same. And then Galerius came to power. The new Augustus in the East was Galerius, and he was more intent than ever, Shelley says, on pushing ahead to the complete extermination of Christianity. Christians said that he was the original instigator of the purge, those that wrote later. Davidson writes, I don't have this on the PowerPoint, the trial was most severe and long-lasting in the East, where Galerius pursued the Christians with passionate determination. In Palestine, Syria, and Egypt, a number of executions took place, though more were deported or imprisoned than were martyred. And you see a picture of a coin there of Galerius. Constantinius, or Constantine Chlorus, who is the father of Constantine the Great, was the other new Augustus. Since Galerius was in the East, this man was in the West, and he was in Britain, the same place that Constantine will be hailed as emperor when it comes his time, who had never pushed the persecution very hard in his district of Gaul, France. And he suspended all measures against the Christians and began to show them favor. So that may have an impact on his son, but for reasons, his own reasons, he did not. So in the West, there was a reprieve, but as we read a minute ago, Galerius was certainly trying to exterminate Christianity in the East. But on his deathbed, he became seriously ill. Galerius did in 311. And on his deathbed, he realized that the attempt to destroy Christianity had failed, and he issued what is called the Edict of Toleration. And for all practical purposes, the last and worst persecution by the Christians from Rome came to an end. I'm showing you a picture, a modern picture of a trilingual, 3 different plaques written in Latin, Bulgarian, and Greek at the St. Sophia Church in Sofia, Bulgaria, at that very site, in that very area. This edict was made by Galerius. And so while he had tried in his life to just persecute them out of existence, he realized public opinion throughout the empire was turning against him. He could no longer take the risk of continuing to maim and kill and torture. And himself, on his deathbed, in his last official act, issued an edict of toleration. All right, so that brings us to Constantine the Great. Constantine then rises to the point of being Augustus. He'll be declared Augustus of the West. After Galerius dies in the East, then all of these guys were promoted, except Constantine has to go and fight the other guys because they're not going to take subordinate roles. And one of those guys is Maxentius. He was the son of one of the Augusti, but was not given a prominent role, but he wanted it. And so on October 28th of 312, Constantine met him in battle 5 miles north of Rome at the Milvian Bridge. And here is a picture of it taken in 2005 that spanned the Tiber River. And there thoroughly defeated Maxentius, and so became in effect, the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, though he would rule in the east and establish Constantinople, and it would become a glorious kingdom. In fact, it would take precedence. When Rome would fall in the west, Constantinople would last for hundreds of years more. In the east, that Roman Empire would continue. Constantine is a picture here of where he was declared, and he was in fact in York, England, when his Roman legions proclaimed him Augustus in 306. The other one that came to power was Licinius. He was Augustus in the east, and he met Constantine in Milan in February of 313, and they cemented their relationship by marriage to Constantine. Licinius married Constantine's half-sister, but that wouldn't last long. Constantine would have to defeat Licinius in battle, but he would be victorious. But in June of 313, while they were still ruling together, Licinius commanded his provincial governors in his and Constantine's names to cease persecuting Christians, restore all properties to individuals and churches, and grant freedom of worship to all. And this became, of course, known as the Edict of Milan. And so for all practical reasons, then, the persecution of by the Romans of the church ceased. In fact, under Constantine, the official religion of the Roman Empire will become Christianity. Think of the amazement of that from the time of the preaching of the early apostles, and I realize there's a lot of falseness to what they're preaching, but we're going to examine some of their doctrines here in the next few weeks. And I think you'll find it interesting that there's still vestiges of truth. They still believe many things that are true, and but they, of course, believe things that are wrong. But Christianity, in a mere 3 centuries, became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that was because of the fact that even though many gave in, Rome recognized bravery, and they recognized those that would give themselves in death. And those things mattered to them. And they just simply ran out of the will to try to overcome Christianity. All right, we're going to look at the Council of Nicaea later. Constantine will call that because of a great issue over the nature of Jesus Christ. But in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, the Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea wrote, "No bishop was absent from the table of the emperor. Bodyguards and soldiers stood guard around the outer court of the palace, but among them the men of God could walk fearlessly." Think about, given all that we've read before, what he's saying. At dinner, some of them lay on the same couch as the emperor, while others rested on cushions on both sides of him. Bishop Paphnutius, if I'm pronouncing that right, from Egypt, who had lost one eye under the Emperor Diocletian, was singled out for special honor by the new emperor. As a sign of friendship between the empire and the church, Constantine kissed the bishop's eyeless cheek. And while that would usher in great peace for the Christianity, it also instigated the church and Rome becoming so involved with each other that you couldn't tell one from the other as time would go forward. And that would go on, of course, throughout the Dark Ages, as we call it, the Middle Ages. All right. The church's reaction then in that time to the apostates. It was believed at that time that there were 3 sins that were considered forgivable by God, but never by the church. And again, understand by the church, meaning this loose concept of the universal church, Catholic Christianity working. Rome is not yet, even though you'll see Pope sometime reference, it's heading that way. But even with what happens with Constantine moving it to the east, there's going to be that rift that divides the Roman Catholics from the Greek Orthodox. And while they'll practice some of the same things, they'll consider themselves to be Christianity. A lot of it had to do with the Roman Empire and the separation of East and West in the Roman Empire. But 3 sins were considered forgivable of God, but never by this loose connection of all these bishops and exercising as if it was one, the church. And so that's what we mean. We're not using it as the Bible uses it. Sexual immorality, adultery specifically, murder, and apostasy. Okay, so when all these people sold out and did not suffer torture, like that bishop that lost his eye, had his eye gouged out, would not deny the faith. Others lost their lives by the hundreds and thousands. those sins were considered forgivable only by God. It's interesting, Shelley makes this point. During the first 2 centuries, most Christians believed that baptism canceled all sins committed up to that moment in the believer's life. That's fascinating. We're going to come back to that and study what they believed about baptism in our studies of the doctrines that we're coming to. All right, so the penalty for these 3 sins was exclusion from fellowship in those local congregations and exclusion from taking communion. So already by this time, communion, the Lord's Supper, most believed was a special channel of divine grace. That will be one of the defining features of Roman Catholicism. Only, for instance, that's why the wafer has to be taken by the priest and placed on the tongue of the one who is receiving it, the Roman Catholic lay person. It can only be administered by the official church because it's a special channel of grace, and that would become a false doctrine that was taught again and again. Withholding it placed a person's salvation in peril. So if you couldn't take communion, then in effect you were lost, and that becomes the fight over what about these apostates. Callistus, who had been a slave, by the way, and had risen to be bishop in Rome, was the first to relax this discipline. He defended his actions, Shelley said, by insisting that the church in Rome was the heir of Peter and the Lord had given keys to Peter to bind and to loose the sins of men. He makes this interesting comment. This marks the first time a bishop in Rome claimed this special authority. So look at when he ruled, 217 to 222. So Callistus was the first time that we know that a Roman bishop is laying claim to that passage in Matthew but remember, the keys were given to all the apostles. Remember that Matthew also records the same terminology used of all the apostles. And it doesn't mean what the Roman Catholic Church has made it to mean. And we made some comments about that earlier. But it's interesting, this is the first time. Again, it's not Roman Catholicism yet. It's Catholic Christianity. It's this loose confederation of all these guys. But it's heading toward that. And when Callistus is making that argument, and that Peter was the one that ended up in Rome, then he's making that his point. All right, Tertullian, though, is totally shocked by what Callistus does. He said, do we forgive apostates and shall we forgive adulterers? That idea that I said to you, adulterers, murderers could not be forgiven. He just could not believe that Callistus had relaxed that as a fellow bishop, all right? Trying to bring that universal church to believe the exact same things everywhere and proclaim it the same way. What we know, thousands of Christians apostatized, sometimes 3/4 of a congregation, and so they were known in Latin as the lapsi, right? The fallen. You see our word lapsed. When something lapses, if your coupon or your driver's license lapses, you know that the date's gone out. So that's the idea. They had fallen away. Many bishops, the ones that were supposedly the rulers, had apostatized. Why seek forgiveness from a leader, Davidson says, who had himself run away when times were hard? How could reconciliation be granted by clergy, by these men, who had also personally buckled under pressure? I mean, there were many laymen that had stood firm. And so, boy, it caused a crisis to happen in the church at that time. Many apostates under severe demands from one bishop would seek out a more lenient bishop. Where Tertullian wouldn't forgive, Callistus in Rome would forgive. The absence of respected church leaders, they either had been martyred or had themselves apostatized, led to the rise of everyday members. They were called the confessors. They had not been killed, but they had been tortured or they had been imprisoned. And so they were considered worthy. Like that bishop that lost his eye. He didn't lose his life, but he would have been called at that time a confessor. And so their status was second only to the martyrs, who were considered and many times were elevated later by the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church to be saints. Again, misunderstanding the Bible's terminology of that. Davidson says those who had been imprisoned were deemed to have earned the right to forgive the sins of believers who had lapsed. Remember that up to that time, only the bishops could forgive sins. And what today we understand Roman Catholicism, officially only the priest can. That's why you have to go in and confess as a Roman Catholic to a priest. That they can only dispense that grace just like they can dispense communion. And it can only come through the official church organization. And so believers began to believe that why trust a bishop that had run away to protect his own skin, but the confessors had suffered torture. So the total break with the Episcopal system that granted the right of bishops to forgive sins. Here's a representation of Cyprian in a modern abbey. The exclusion of apostates meant their souls were damned. Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, said, outside the church there is no salvation. Again, remember what I said to you when we studied about this is a lot like Diotrephes, who would not allow those that the apostles had fellowship. He would kick them basically out of the church. He threw them out of the church, John said. But they were still in fellowship vertically with God. All right, so Cyprian, in effect, is doing that same sort of thing. The idea that the church alone could dispense salvation, rather than thinking in terms of it's individual, it's between you and God. What somebody recognizes horizontally can be absolutely wrong. It might be right. They may be disciplining you in a local congregation for biblical reasons, but they've been wrong before. I mean, we know that in modern times. Churches have just been flat wrong at times in who they've disciplined. And we probably all have seen it and known about it. They can be right many times, but it doesn't take away from the times that they're wrong. The idea being that even because they are not allowed to be members of a local church doesn't mean that they're out of fellowship with God. God alone knows who are His and in fellowship with Him vertically. And so this concept is a horrible concept of thinking that it's the church that dispenses salvation, and of course that's where they're heading. They're heading toward Roman and excommunication. If you're excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, that's it. How could the church receive those who had denied the faith? Shelley said, wasn't this the sin against the Holy Spirit for which there was no forgiveness? What evil could be worse than to deny from fear and pain, the only way to salvation? If this is pardoned, anything can be pardoned. Isn't that fascinating? There are just some sins they thought could not be pardoned, and that was wrong. God pardons all sins, except, as He says, the sin against the Holy Spirit. Depending on the sin, only after periods of sorrow for sin were sinners readmitted to the church, and this would begin the beginning of penance. Okay, this idea in Roman Catholicism of earning your way back into the full fellowship with the Roman Catholic Church as it would be in the future. Cyprian, for instance, said those who had obtained certificates, those libellus, plural and singular, without actually sacrificing, that is, they bribed somebody, were to be restored to the church after varying periods of discipline. Those who had sacrificed, who had gone ahead and gone through with it, could not be readmitted only on their deathbed when they died. Then the church would allow them back in. And clergy who had lapsed were not allowed to re-enter their orders ever. They were not allowed to come back and be a bishop or a presbyter. All right, opposed to Cyprian was a man by the name of Novatian. He was a prominent presbyter in Rome. Novatian argued that the church had no power to grant forgiveness to those guilty of murder, adultery, and apostasy. So he held fast to that hard line that we saw. It could only intercede for God's mercy at the last judgment. Another Roman presbyter, Cornelius, who became the bishop of Rome, claimed grave sins could be forgiven by the church. And Novatian and a group of confessors withdrew from the Church of Rome and started their own congregation. Now, sometimes you don't know about all that kind of thing. Studying Roman Catholic history, they may not often mention that, but you'll find one time in Roman Catholic history there were 3 popes at the same time. Novatian is just an early example of this breaking away. That is, as so often plagued Christianity out, is that when people have serious divisions over matters that they believe are doctrine, then there is this final separation and this pulling apart of those that should be one. But again, not one the way that the Catholic Church at this time is trying to do it. And so many things they're instigating is not according to what the Bible teaches. But once again, you see this sort of thing of the division that we know about it. I wanted to tell you about the martyrdom of Cyprian of Carthage. Then this goes back to Valerian Decius, the end of 256 under Valerian. He was placed under house arrest. He refused to sacrifice to the gods. and confess that Jesus was the Christ before the proconsul. He's banished to a place called Corba. He is a wealthy man, by the way. A year later, he's put under house arrest at his villa outside Carthage. And then he is brought before the proconsul. He will not renounce Jesus Christ. And he is examined by him, and that was left to us. Galerius Maximus was a proconsul, and he said, "You have long lived an irreligious life and have drawn together a number of men bound by an unlawful association." Remember, Christianity was an illegal religion in the Roman Empire. "And professed yourself an open enemy to the gods and the religion of Rome, and thus to Rome itself, to the state. And the pious, most sacred, and august emperors, the authority of law shall be ratified in your blood," and he was condemned to death. And so Cyprian was taken outside the city. A great company of people followed him. He took his own robes off, took his own blindfold and bound his eyes. He prayed first. He knelt and prayed first. Then he bound his own eyes, and then he was beheaded and met his death. All right, so we appreciate you listening to our study today. Next week we will conclude by talking a bit about the summary of the Roman persecution. And I want to look at a phrase that Paul has of those that were in Caesar's household. And I think you'll find kind of a fascinating idea that the Christians in Caesar's household would find protection when others were persecuted in the empire at wide. And they were also going to look at the early worship in the churches in the 2nd century. And we want to look at the Lord's Supper and some things like that. So again, thank you for your attention. And we look forward to our study next week.